So, okay, so this is our first objective. Analyze the presence of unemployment in an economy. All right, so what I did was I pulled up the unemployment rate, the national unemployment rate from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. This is seasonally adjusted and includes everyone 16 years and over, and this is a percent change. So we had relatively low unemployment until COVID, and now it's shooting up, and I think our latest statistic is 13.3, so it's down from April. But if you take a look down here at the bottom, let's see if I can do this. Down here at the bottom, you're going to see, sure you're right, you're going to see, nope, sorry, there we are. Okay, what you're going to see is a lot of changes due to COVID. And I think that makes sense, especially when we think about going from 4.4 in April 2020 to April 2020, 14.7. So that's kind of incredible. And the underlying report you can read right here, which talks about Nevada being the highest unemployment rate during the last report. Now, we get the unemployment report monthly from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. So what exactly does it include? Well, unemployment are those individuals that are seeking jobs. Okay, and we're going to take a look at how we actually calculate this. Discouraged workers are not seeking a job. And so we're going to see, how do we come up with this 13.3%? So unemployment usually ends with the job seeker finding a job, and it may be hard to try and find a job. For example, during Corona, it was extremely hard to do that, and they want to qualify for unemployment. One of the things that we see is a little bit of a moral hazard, because as they talked about during COVID, that individuals were making more on unemployment than they were making on their jobs. So what would happen is that the individual didn't really want to return to the labor force because they were making more money on unemployment, and we would call that a moral hazard. There are different types of unemployment measures. So here's all the ones, table 2 in your book, U1, okay, all the way to U6. And when we take a look at the unemployment rate of 13.3, that is the U5 unemployment rate, okay? So the Bureau of Labor Statistics, they differentiate. There's some terms here that we should know. So a marginally attached worker are neither working nor looking for a job, but indicate that they want to get a job, and they're available for a job. And they've worked in the recent past, and that's usually within the last 90 days. Okay, so that's marginally attached. We have some new things. Discouraged workers not currently looking for a job or are not available. And it's usually individuals who have given work. Sometimes people will be employed part-time. They really want a full-time job, but they're willing to settle for a part-time. And that might be the case with some of the individuals watching this. So how long are the unemployed without work? Most unemployment periods are relatively short. Okay, most unemployment observed at any given time tends to be long-term. So what does that mean? It means individually, it tends to be short. But when we take a look at unemployment as a whole, then there is some long-term unemployment. Most people in their lifetime will become unemployed, but because that's the reason, because people change careers, not jobs, at least 3 times during their lifetime. And that might be, going from working in a career in retail while you're in school, to your chosen profession, to maybe a part-time career or something in retirement. But this is relatively short, okay? And these individuals can find a job if they want to. Okay, so this is how we reconcile those two statements right here. And again, most of the unemployment problem is attributable to few workers who are jobless for a long time. Most people are not jobless for a long time. When we talk about a long time, we mean greater than that 90-day period. Okay, so how do we define employed? Employed is going to be anyone who is 16 years or over, okay, that they are a paid employee and they have worked. They might work in their family business, or they might be an unpaid worker in their family's business. Okay, so they could own their own business as long as, or a paid employee, and they work unpaid in their family business. So we have full and part-time workers that we would count as employed. Unemployed are those who are not employed, but who are trying to be employed. So you have to actively look for a job within the last 30 days here. And those who are laid off. So that's what we saw during the coronavirus, was a lot of individuals there. And then we have a third category. So how do we come up with the unemployment rate? We start with employed. We have a second category called unemployed. And our third category is not in the labor force. So these individuals might be retirees, disabled, incarcerated, the idle rich, and we're also going to put in here, and you'll see full-time students is there. Also, we're going to put in here discouraged workers. And so those are individuals that have just kind of given up on the job market. Okay. So this is how the three categories played out in January 2019. So employed, unemployed, and not in the labor force. Now, this is how we reconcile this. So when we're talking about calculating the unemployment rate, first we want to know that we take the adult population here, and that's the number of people employed plus the number of people unemployed plus the number of people not in the labor force. Again, greater than 16 years of age. The employed, we just talked about what fits into that category. The unemployed, again, actively looking for work. And then that category not in the labor force, full-time students, incarcerated, active military, and so on. And over here, we have the labor force. And the labor force is made up of, okay, let me get it. There we are. The labor force is equal to the number of people employed plus the number of people unemployed. So these two categories make up the labor force, and the adult population includes the labor force plus not in the labor force. So let's do this. There we go. Okay. Now, sometimes the unemployment rate, and as I said, nationally, it's 13.3%, up substantially. In which of the following, what happens to the unemployment rate, and does that give you an accurate impression of what's happening in the market? Sue lost her job and begins looking for a new one. So I like to think of this as, think about the categories, right? So there are three categories. There are employed, there are unemployed, and there is the third category of not in the labor force. Okay. Now, again, the employed plus the unemployed, they make up the labor force. Yes, the labor force. Okay, so let's look at what would happen to the unemployment rate. Well, I haven't really told you how to compute it yet, have I? So the unemployment rate that we're going to calculate is going to equal the number of people unemployed divided by the labor force. Doing that first, and then times 100 expressed as a percent. So let's look at our first scenario here and see what happens when Sue changes categories. So Sue was employed, right? Let's see if I can find my pen. There we go. Okay, so Sue was employed. So she started here and she moved to unemployed. What would happen to the unemployment rate? And then A, the unemployment rate would increase. And that kind of makes sense, doesn't it? Because she's unemployed at the present time. Okay, let's look at our next statement. John, a steel worker who's been out of work since his mill closed last year, becomes discouraged and gives up looking for work. So think about those three categories. So John was unemployed, right? So he was counted in the unemployment rate, but then he moves to a discouraged worker or not in the labor force. And when he does that, when John gives up looking for work, this is what's interesting, is the unemployment rate is going to go down. And why does it go down? Because he moved from being unemployed, which is counted in the unemployment rate, to not in the labor force, which is not counted. Remember, the unemployment rate are the number of people unemployed divided by the labor force. So this one kind of goes, this is weird, right? The unemployment rate could go down, but actually that could be a bad thing. Okay. Sam, the sole earner in his family of five, just lost his $80,000 job as a research scientist. He immediately takes a job at McDonald's till he can find a new one. So Sam, where does he start? He starts in the employed category as a scientist. Okay. Then he moves to the employed category. So he stays in the same category and now he works at McDonald's. Okay. So this one, the unemployment rate is going to be unchanged. But we call this the idea of underemployment, meaning that you're more qualified than the jobs that you will take. Okay. All right, so the unemployment rate increases, and again, that kind of makes sense to us with Sue. John, the unemployment rate goes down, okay, because he's not being counted as unemployed because he gave up looking for work. Doesn't really give an accurate impression, I would agree. And then Sam, unemployment rate unchanged. So that's what we're going to do in this objective, is calculate the unemployment rate for an economy. And remember, just a couple of terms to remember, that the labor force is made up of the number of people employed plus the number of people unemployed. How we calculate the unemployment rate, I talked about in the last objective, but we're just going to take the number of people unemployed divided by the labor force times 100, and we express that answer as a percentage. So it's the unemployment rate, or U rate, which I've referred to in the intro to these little videos. This graph gives you a historical perspective on the unemployment rate since 1960 along the red. The blue is a new term, and the blue is what we call the natural rate of unemployment. This natural rate is that there's always going to be people changing jobs, and changing jobs is not necessarily a bad thing, particularly if you're changing to a better position with better pay, better opportunities, and so on. So we're always going to have a certain amount of unemployment. This natural rate is set based upon trends and where we see things. And here we did have a natural rate of 6%. The natural rate now is 4%. That might get adjusted, that 4%, from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And the reason is because of Corona. It may go up a point for the foreseeable future, but I'm not so sure. I haven't kept up on the natural rate and changes and such. Okay, so here's a problem that we're going to work out. The adult population of the US by group, and the number of people employed, the number of people unemployed and not in the labor force. So we want to compute the labor force, because that's what we're going to need to know to compute the unemployment rate. So remember, the labor force is equal to the number of people employed I'll call that A, plus the number of people unemployed, and I'll call that B. We do not look at not in the labor force in this particular scenario. So 145.9 plus 8.5, how about 154.4? Okay, so now we know our labor force, but we want to compute our unemployment rate. And I'm going to do that on the next slide just so I have a little bit more room. So we said that the labor force, when we added the employed and unemployed together, we said that the labor force was 154.4 million. To compute the unemployment rate, what we're going to do is use that formula on the preceding slides, and we're going to say the number of people unemployed divided by the labor force. And remember, we just calculated the labor force right here. So let's take a look. The number of people unemployed is 8.5. So we're going to take 8.5, divide it by the 154.4, multiply that by 100, and express it as a percentage. So let me go ahead and do that. I have 5.51. So that's what the unemployment rate would be in this scenario. And let's check our answers just to be sure. 5.5. I might have keyed in something a little bit incorrectly here, but 154.4 is the labor force, the unemployment rate of 5.5. So I usually ask students at this point, is 5.5 bad? And it's not necessarily bad if the natural rate is 6. The natural rate kind of gives us a barometer. If the natural rate is 6 and we're at 5.5, that's not a problem. If the natural rate is 4 and we're at 5.5, then that might be more of a significant indicator that things are not, economically speaking, going according to plan. That's a little strange. Okay. This is weird. All right, so we're going to calculate the labor force participation rate in a given scenario. And let me go ahead and start my slideshow. Okay, so the labor force participation rate is the total adult population that is working or is employed or unemployed, because remember, that's what we defined as the labor force. So employed plus unemployed. All right, so the fraction that is going to participate in the labor market, even though you're unemployed, you're still looking for work, okay? So here, calculate the labor force participation rate using the following data, okay? So remember, for the labor force participation rate, we're going to take the number of people employed plus the number of people unemployed to get the labor force. So when we did that, we ended up with, let's see, 145.9 plus 8.5, and that was 154.40, 4 million, okay? Now, what we're going to do is we're going to add in the not in the labor force to the number that we've got for the labor force to get the adult population. So I'm going to add 79.2 to the 154.4, and that gives me a total of 233.6 million. And so all I did was add in, whoops, sorry, let me just, all I did was add in, okay, the 79.2, not in the labor force, to get, and this would be our adult population, 23.6. Okay, and then what I'm going to do is take the 230, I'm going to take the labor force, 154.4 labor force, divide that by the 233.6, multiply that by 100 and express it as a percentage. So when we do that, we end up with the labor force. We already did the unemployment rate. And so taking the numbers that I just calculated a moment ago, we end up with adult population of 233.6 divided by, and let me go back and pick up our labor force, 154.4. 154.4 times 100 is going to equal our labor force participation rate, 0.4, divided by 233.6, and that's going to give us 66.10%. So what that means is approximately 66 people out of 100 are participating in the labor force. So here's the calculations. Again, what we did was we took that labor force, the one that we calculated previously in a different objective, but it's also the number of people employed plus unemployed. Okay, and then we added in the people that are not in the labor force to get the adult population. Labor force participation rate is the labor force from above in our previous objective divided by the population times 100 expressed as a percentage. Okay, so here's some other examples of labor force participation rates. And so how much of that, how many people, you can look at it in 10 or 100, whichever you prefer, are working. So one of the things that we know is the labor force participation rate does differ according to different characteristics, I think is the best way to put it. So if we talk about ethnicity, that is definitely one. We talk about age, that is definitely one. We also can talk about educational levels. And so again, just taking a look at some of the differences that we have here, and this is for the US population of 2018. So among those, we see the highest labor force participation rate in white males. We see the lowest in white females in terms of the labor force participation rates. Among teens, we can look at that as well. And we see the lowest numbers of Black teens labor force participation rate. And we see the highest number in white females labor force participation rate. So one of the things that we've looked at is gender, because I should have added that to the last slide in terms of ways that we can segregate data to take a look at labor market experience. So one of the things that we see is there's lower rates of labor force participation among women than there are men. One of the reasons for this is because women tend to leave the labor force among childbearing ages of 25 to 54 to leave the labor force for a particular or maybe an extended period of time to raise children. That's one reason. And one of the things that we know, though, is that if we have higher educational levels among the individual women, then what we're going to say is it provides a greater opportunity cost for leaving the labor force. Okay. Again, some of the different experiences among blacks, among teenagers that we see among the labor force participation rates. Again, taking a look at the difference between gender, we saw huge differences in the 1950s when traditional male-female roles or male-female roles were more traditionally defined, and we see that gap closing, although we still know that there is a wage gap. And if you read about the reasons economically for the wage gap, talks a lot about the idea of leaving the workforce for a period of time, particularly when kids are younger, the opportunity cost of working versus affording childcare. Many times it doesn't pay to work because all of your money is going toward childcare expenses. And economists really study the idea of re-entering the labor force after leaving the labor force for an extended period of time. So let's say that you're 25, you leave the labor force to have a child or two, you try to re-enter at 28. There's a skills issue because 3 years of eroding skills are one of the things that we see. Pretty exciting about that, though, is that online education, things like you're doing currently, can help to ensure that those skills do not erode within that 3-year time period. Okay, so again, when we take a look at the difference between the participation rates in, say, the 1950s, this is kind of what we saw. And then in 2018, some really bigger differences as roles were breaking with gender norms. Roles are fluid, I guess I want to say that, because many times it's not based upon gender who stays home to provide childcare. And so you're seeing some of those differences in the participation rates. Okay, so again, taking a look at gender differences, and again, counted as being out of the labor force, things like full-time students and stay at home, whoever that role might be. Hi, and welcome to chapter 29, the final portion of the objective 1. I know that there's a lot of objectives coupled in there. I used to do them all separately, but now I put the little transition break so that you can easily stop or fast forward whenever you need to. So interested to know, do you want them shorter and more of them, or do you like the longer one? There are alternative measures of unemployment besides the ones that we focused on so far. So what I want to do is to show you those using some challenge problems. So let me go ahead and share my screen. We're going to do this one. Okay. So when we look at these alternative measures, aside from U3, remember that when we measure the unemployment rate, it's not a perfect indicator of what's going on. Some people misrepresent their status. It doesn't include these discouraged workers, but using U3 does help us to determine, as long as we're always using U3 and not trying to use U1 one year and year U6 another, those kind of things. So we're going to look at these alternative measures. And so this is a nice little, and I believe this is in your book as well, a nice little graphic that represents some of the big differences. So far what we've done, come on, where are you, pen? Pen. So far what we've done is this is the official rate that we have calculated in this objective, okay? And we, again, want to look at the unemployment rate along with the labor force participation rate. So let's take a look at the first one. Again, U3 we've already looked at, but perhaps if you want to fast forward doing that for this one, go ahead. But let's take a look at an example problem. So here we have the civilian labor force, other statistics from particular groups, and what is the U3 measure of labor underutilization. So again, what is the U3 unemployment rate? So here what we would do is we would look at for U3, we're going to say, all right, we have the civilian labor force at 100 million. And we have, let's see, 6.2 unemployed. So we're going to gather these two statistics, and we're going to say 6.2 million divided by 100 million would be 6.2%. So that would be the U3 that you're used to looking at. U1 looks at persons unemployed 15 weeks or longer as a percentage of the civilian labor force. So U1 here in this particular example, I just switch here. U1 is going to be the 1.6, again, these individuals, 1.6 million divided by the 100 million, and that's going to give us the 1.6% or A in this particular example. So that would be U1. U2, job losers and persons who have completed temporary jobs as a percent of the civilian labor force. So people who have completed temporary jobs, 3.1, civilian labor force, 100 million. Hopefully you can already see the answer. That'd be great if you can. So 3.1 divided by 100 million is going to give us 3.1%. U4 says, okay, we're going to take total unemployment and we're going to add to that discouraged workers, and then take that as a percent of the civilian labor force, and we're going to add discouraged workers to the bottom as well. So in U4, a little bit more complex perhaps. So what we're going to do is to take the total unemployment right here, 6.2. 6.2 plus discouraged workers, which would be 6.2 is already in this 7.0. So I'm going to go ahead and say, okay, that must be 0.8, but it didn't ask us to figure that out, 7.0. So we take the 7.0 million, right, as a percent of the civilian labor force. And so in looking at this one, we're going to say, okay, what is the marginally attached, total unemployment plus marginally attached workers? And that's going to be our, U4, I jumped ahead, sorry. And so U4 is going to be the 7.0, sorry, jumped ahead, divided by the 100, and that gives us 7%. U5 is the one I just looked at 2 seconds ago, is total unemployed plus discouraged workers plus marginally attached workers as a percent of the labor force plus all marginally attached workers. So U5, a little bit more complex, and that's why I was looking over here at my notes here. Okay, in our U5, what we're going to do here is to take a look, and again, we have the definitions there for us. So what we're going to do to measure the U5 is we're going to take the unemployed plus discouraged, right, which is right here at 7.0, plus all marginally attached, which is our 8.1 million. You want to be careful on these graphs because, as you can see, we went from 6.2 and then we added in discouraged workers. So that also includes the unemployed before it. There's some test questions like that, and I just want you to be careful. Okay, so these are all include the prior one to it, just like part-time employed workers are already included in the employed category. So don't double count. Kind of a hint on some of the possible test type questions. So we see that the total unemployed plus all marginally attached workers, that's going to be 8.1. And then what we're going to do is to take the civilian labor force, which is 100. We're going to add to it job losers and persons who have temporary unemployment, and that's going to be 3.1. And that gives us 103.1. We're going to take the 8.1 of the total unemployed plus marginally attached workers. We're going to divide it by the 103.1. Multiply that by 100 and express it as a percent. and we're going to get 7.86%, which is very close to 7.9%. So a little bit different in terms of how we look at these things. There's also U6, which takes unemployed, marginally attached workers, employed part-time for economic reasons, and then we take that as a percent of civilian plus marginally attached workers. So hopefully these definitions can give you what you should be dividing by if you are asked to calculate alternative measures besides U3. Okay, this is the end of Objective 1, and I'll see you back next time. Thanks.